Hello, class. Today's lesson is being prepared for Tuesday, April 21st, 2020. This is the 22nd lesson of virtual home instruction. It is week 5, and I want to start by going over the study guide with you. Based on the study guides I've seen, it looks like many of you are going to do really well. You have a very good grasp of the material. For those of you who struggled with it, either you haven't been following along or maybe you don't understand the material. Throughout today, during your during your block, if you have any questions, go on Google Hangouts and request a meet, and we could talk one-on-one. I'd appreciate as many people to join during your block as possible, so this way we could actually have some discussion on any of the material that you don't understand. Many of you, however, will be fine with just going over my completed study guide. I will also post 2 completed study guides that your peers prepared. I think your peers did a very nice job. I think sometimes it's better to read things from your peers' perspective. And so whatever works best for you is fine with me. I would use any one of these 3 study guides. I would also use the presentations. I'm going to post a copy of the Civil War Presentation Challenge. It will indicate who came in what place. You see it here. And in addition, it will include the last few slides that I've created after that challenge that are not part of anyone's student-generated presentations. So again, what you want to use are those 3 study guides. What you want to use is any one of these 5 presentations that were created for you. And then lastly, you want to review this material that will also be on the test. So let's go to the study guide. All the material on the study guide would be found in this presentation somewhere. And as you're reviewing this stuff, please try to get away from simply memorizing and instead think about the big picture. Now, when we talk about kicking the can down the road, most of you got what that meant. That basically meant that here's an issue. We are going to not address it. We're just going to kick down the road and hope to deal with it down the road. And I think, we see that a lot in leadership. People are afraid to take a stance. We see that with a lot of things in our government, whether it's healthcare, whether it's Social Security, or the budget in general. There are a lot of issues that have historically not been dealt with, and instead they just get kicked down the road. This, of course, applies to slavery. Now, you could go all the way back and say, well, when we created a nation and we declared our independence in 1776, whether it was under the Articles of Confederation or whether it was under the Constitution, it should have been addressed. And so you could say that this can has been being kicked for a very long time. Obviously, you could go back even before that. But for this test, we're going to start with the Missouri Compromise. And I think we've been talking about the Missouri Compromise for a long time. And so there were really 2 parts of it. The first part was maintaining a balance where Missouri would be a slave state, even though it was above the 36th parallel, and Maine would be the free state. Once again, whenever you're studying for something, maps and graphs and things, when you have visuals, they really help you out. So if you go back to this map here, you'll see that this is roughly the 36th, 30th parallel. And this, even though it's above it, it becomes a slave state. Maine gets added as a free state, and we maintain the balance. Another interesting thing here, you could also use this map to see, again, where are things located? Well, Missouri, slave state, but it doesn't join the Confederates. Kentucky, slave state. West Virginia did not like being part of Virginia. It didn't like Virginia going and joining the Confederates, so they declared their independence, but they still have slaves. Maryland has slaves, and Delaware has slaves. And as we get more into the war, these border states, remember, these are the border states, they're going to be very, very important because it gives the northern troops a buffer zone, basically. All right, so the Missouri Compromise is really for our discussion. what really begins the kicking of this can down the road. The next thing that we're going to see that really highlights the fact that we have a problem here is that Texas is admitted to the United States as a slave state. There are a number of reasons why slavery was permitted in Texas, but we have to go back a few decades and remember that when Texas was part of the Spanish empire, so to speak, and they wanted to increase the population, they would invite Americans. And the same thing applied when the Mexicans became independent of Spain. They invited Americans, and Americans brought with them slaves. So when Texas finally gets its statehood, it is, of course, in 1845, already a slave-holding state. So it was going to be very hard to admit Texas as a free state. And of course, that's going to make a bunch of Northerners angry. Let's move on. So the Mexican-American War really has nothing to do with whether or not Texas is going to be part of the United States or not. It has more to do with where the territory would be. So there's a river here, and the Mexicans said that this is the southern border of Texas. Texans said, no, it's here. And so again, that's what the war was all about. But less important than of what the war was about, what's more important is the outcome. And the outcome is we win the war in 1848, and we obtain all of this territory. So now we don't only have to address what's going to happen with this territory, because we don't. It's already been decided in 1845. But now we're going to have to decide all this territory. And so if you look, it says that thanks to the Guadalupe Hidalgo Treaty, we get New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, Nevada, and most importantly, California. And the reason why California is the most important is because California had all the resources. California had a lot of people, right? And so because of the size, one, it's going to be an issue. And two, because take a look where it lies with regard to the 36th parallel. It's partially in the north and partially in the south. So this is going to be a major issue. And so the next treaty that comes along is the Compromise of 1850. And basically the Compromise of 1850 says that California can be a free state as long as the Southerners get what they want. And what they wanted was the Fugitive Slave Act. And the Fugitive Slave Act, which should go here as well, because that's what this is. And I left this blank because many of you left it blank, and I wanted you to see that it should have gone here. The Fugitive Slave Act, right? And what this is it is the law that helped heat up the sectional divide, because the North actually now had to take part in slavery. Like again, in the years prior to 1850, the North hated slavery, but many Northerners were like, well, you guys keep it down there. It's none of our business. We're not going to get involved. But when California becomes a state, a free state, the North, unfortunately, now is subject to the Fugitive Slave Act. And basically, by law, they are required to take runaway slaves and assist the southern states. So now they can no longer remain indifferent. Now they're actually actively part in this process. And so it really agitates the North. At that time, of course, you have all these other territories, and the Compromise of 1850 is going to say these territories will get to decide on their own as well. But this really never becomes an issue because these territories do not get populated enough for these territories to have to address slavery or not. Whereas these do, okay, Kansas and Nebraska. And that's why 4 years later, we come to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which says that these states get to use popular sovereignty. Now, people said by vote, right? But basically, what the 1854 Kansas-Nebraska Act is saying, and again, think about it logically, it's saying, remember this line that was created, the 36th parallel? Well, that no longer applies. Instead, we're going to use popular sovereignty. And so that made the South very happy, because now they said, if we get border ruffians to go into Kansas, we can, stack the deck, so to speak, and really fix the election. And we'll have more pro-slavery people, because remember, Missouri is a slave state. We'll have more pro-slavery people in Kansas. They'll vote for a pro-slavery constitution. Kansas will use popular sovereignty to become a slave state. Most people in Nebraska had migrated from up here. They were all free states. So Nebraska really was never really a question, but Nebraska was. And so I asked you, in addition to opening up territories in the North that should have been closed to slavery as a result of the Missouri Compromise, another harmful consequence of the Nebraska Act is that it led to bloody Kansas, or bleeding Kansas, where you see lots and lots of violence. Now, someone in the study guide said it led to the formation of the Republican Party, and that's true. But a harmful consequence would be bleeding Kansas. Now, of course, if you don't like the Republicans, you could see it as a harmful consequence. But the bottom line is that we are talking about bloody Kansas, in which you will see actions of Preston Brooks beating up Charles Sumner with a cane. And remember, Preston Brooks was a House of Representative. Senator Charles Sumner was a senator from up in Massachusetts. And basically, this points out a number of things. One, that the system of checks and balances is breaking down, and the government is not dealing with this issue effectively. And it's also showing you just how heated things are. The other set of violence that we see is John Brown. John Brown begins to get naughty in 56 when he attacks a group of pro-slavery forces in Lawrence, Kansas, and then a few years later, he plans an attack on a federal arsenal, which is located in Virginia. So again, these actions demonstrate that the Nebraska-Kansas Act was going to lead to violence, and it did. Dred Scott. Dred Scott is perhaps the worst the worst Supreme Court decision. I think a very, very close second, and we'll get to this later on, will be Plessy versus Ferguson. In some ways, I think Plessy versus Ferguson is a little worse in that Plessy versus Ferguson was a Supreme Court case in 1896, which was decided well after the Civil War, well after we had apparently dealt with this issue. And so I kind of have more negativity towards that case. I think both cases are extremely horrible, but for this test, we're only focusing on Dred Scott, because Dred Scott decision basically said that if you are a slave or a former slave and you escaped, you are not a citizen. It even went so far as to say there's a good chance that no African Americans, even those who were born into freedom in the North, there's a good chance that some of them, or all of them rather, should not be considered citizens either. But Dred Scott was a former slave, and in this case said that he could be returned to his former masters. So this is, again, a horrible, horrible decision. And it just goes to show that both sides are pretty much dug in. At this time, the Supreme Court is controlled primarily by pro-slavery justices, okay? So let's keep on. Now, not only will you see rising tensions in, of course, the Supreme Court, in Congress, you're also going to see this tension rising in the parties in general, because in the parties you had Northern Whigs and you had Southern Whigs. You had Northern Democrats, you had Southern Democrats, and it's really quite simple. Northern Whigs were anti-slavery, Northern Democrats were anti-slavery, Southern Whigs and Southern Democrats were pro-slavery. So when the Compromise of 1850 is passed, it makes Northern Whigs very angry because the Northern Whigs are like, wait a minute. Yeah, we like the fact that California was admitted as a free state, but now we have to support slavery under the Fugitive Slave Act. All right, so that's how the tensions in the Whig Party break down. What really causes the Democratic Party to break down would be the Dred Scott decision, because at the time, President Buchanan is the president, and he basically endorses the Supreme Court decision that was in 1857, thinking that it would satisfy both people, both sides. He thought that since the Supreme Court has spoken, he thought people would take it as, well, of course, the South would like it because they're going to get their property back and they're going to not be citizens. But they also thought that the North would be like, you know what? The Supreme Court has spoken. I guess we'll have to go with that. But that's not what happened, especially since a few years earlier, since the Whigs and the Democrats had been fighting among themselves, they got together and they formed the Republican Party in 1854. So by 1857, when this case comes down, these people already, these Democrats, these Northern Democrats, all ready to join in the Republican Party, and this just is the icing on the cake. Okay, so now we discussed possibilities of how slavery can be avoided. And there were a number of political, social, economic, technological. Listen, I'm not going to ask you to know every single thing that could have changed throughout history that would have prevented a civil war. But if I say, is this an example of a technological development that led to the survival of slavery, and talking about the cotton gin, of course it was, because remember, the cotton mill made cotton more popular again. And who's going to pick that cotton? Well, the slaves, okay? So you should have a general understanding of the difference between something that's political versus social versus economic versus technological. But despite of all these things that did go in a very horrible direction, right? This is horrible. Whites of the South saw themselves as socially superior. That's true. Had this changed, things may have been different, but it didn't change. So because these things did contribute to the buildup, all you needed was something to break the camel's back. It's called a straw that broke the camel's back, and that is the election of 1860, in which we see Abraham Lincoln elected as president. And we all know that they were afraid that he would end slavery. Now, right after South Carolina seceded, how many more states joined them? How many states joined South Carolina? And of course, that's 6. So we had 1 plus 6. Lincoln gives the inaugural address, trying to convince Southern states not to leave and that the Union could be preserved peacefully. Remember, this is Lincoln's whole thing. He's like pleading with the South. He doesn't want to use force. And he says, we exist in perpetuity, which means that the Confederation does not exist. The Confederate States of America does not exist. However, not only does it not go away, it gets bigger, because after the attack on Fort Sumter, Abraham Lincoln calls on 500,000 troops to join the Union Army, which then turns the other states against the Union as well. The only states, again, that did not join the Confederate States of America include Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware. So the war breaks out. Now, again, this I consider a battle. It is a battle, but it's more of an attack. And the first really battle we get, of course, is the Battle of Bull Run. And when the war begins, both sides have advantages. Neither side has a clear advantage over the other, even though they may believe they do. They don't. Some of the North's advantages, and I think this here chart illustrates it very nicely, that these are the benefits that that the North has. More people, more railroads, more industry, more manufacturing. What they don't have is leadership. The South has the better leadership. So, what advantages did the South have? Well, they have the home court advantage. They know where wants to reign. They have better military leadership, and they have a stronger will to win and to preserve their way of life and to preserve their economic system. What strategies did the North use? Well, again, the most important thing they used was what was called the anaconda. Anaconda is a snake, and so you see it was called Scott's because it's Winfield Scott. He was the one who came up with this, and he said if we just strangle the South and we block off their ports and their access to the Mississippi, they will not be able to get any supplies. We just have to wait it out, and this was the plan that they instigated. All right. The South believed that they had to wait it out as well, that if they could simply not lose, that they would eventually win, because they believed that the Northerners would lose their will to fight, that eventually the North would say, what are we fighting for anyway? If they want to go, let them go. And Jefferson Davis, of course, is the president of the Confederate States of America from the beginning to the end. And he doesn't want war, but why might he have attacked Fort Sumter? Well, he very clearly expressed the fact that if he was going to run a country, the Confederate States of America, he could not have a U.S. or a Union federal port located in his territory. South Carolina, of course, is deep in the Confederation. All right, again, looking at the map, here, Charleston is down here, and that's where the port is, or the fort rather, Fort Sumter. Okay, let's go back to the study guide. What might explain the South's respectful treatment of the Northern prisoners from Fort Sumter? And this is how I put it. Although the South used military force to take control of Fort Sumter, perhaps the South did not want to do anything to instigate a full-on war with the North, and that might explain why they treated the Northern troops with respect. Other explanations might include that they were trying to set a precedent in the event Southern troops were captured by the North. So they figure if we treat the Northern troops well, if they capture us, they'll treat us well. Or they realized that they were once fellow countrymen and therefore maintained a high level of respect. And it was probably a combination of these things. And lastly, what does the Battle of Bull Run reveal about the true nature of war? Well, of course, it reveals how long and how deadly it's going to be and how gruesome. If you look here, though, at the stats, in the Battle of Bull Run, there's less than 1,000 people who die. Now, I know that's horrible, but you're going to see just a year later in the second Battle of Bull Run, you're going to have tens of thousands. So this is nothing. This first Battle of Bull Run is nothing compared to what we would see down the road. All right, so that's the study guide. Again, if you have any questions on this, we will review it later on. I'll be available all day. If you want to set up a meet, when you go into Google Hangouts, just, send out a message and I will join. The next thing I want to do real quickly is go over Google Classroom. Listen, some of you are still getting lost in Google Classroom, and I think it's because you're missing lessons and you're not listening to the instructions I'm giving you. But if you see, everything in the stream has been posted. Day 22, activity. day 21, lesson. I'm either posting a lesson or an activity. Like when I posted this lesson on Monday, which was yesterday, there was no activity because the activity was to finish the study guide, right, from last Thursday. And if you look, it's just go back. Now, like some people couldn't find the student responsibility thing that they had to complete. And well, that's because you didn't do it the day that I assigned it. But if you had done it the day that I assigned it, you would have no problem in finding it. Sometimes I'll put the lesson and activity together. All right. So all you have to do is scroll backwards and look for what you're looking for. The other way to do it is to simply go into classwork and go. Now, when you go into classwork, it's going to post things that were not categorized. But if you just scroll down to VHI, you're going to see that this is everything in VHI. So here was day 20, here was day 19, here was day 18. I think you get the point. Now, the test is tomorrow. The test is 25 multiple choice questions on a Google form. Once again, you have 3 hours to complete the test. Remember, all activities are due by 11:59. So if for any reason you do not get to the slot that you signed up for, simply shoot me an email and say, I'm working on it now. You still have 3 hours. So when you start it, it puts you, just so you know, it puts you in a spreadsheet that I get. Once you open it, it lists you in the spreadsheet. And so it shows me when you start it and then when you finish it. So the 3 hour focus is because I want you to focus. I want you to say, all right, I'm doing it first thing in the morning. I'm getting up at 8 o'clock. I have until 11. I'm going to focus. I'm going to bang this out. I'm going to get a great grade, right? Now, again, let's say you woke up at 11. Then just email me. Ms. Davis, I slept in. I'm going to do it block 5. Then I'll go into my spreadsheet and I'll change it. And so this way, when you submit it, it'll match up with the spreadsheet. It's not a big deal. It's not a big deal at all. I just can't have, with an assessment, 120 Google Forms open all day. That's just not how it works. So the Google Forms are going to be posted first thing on Wednesday. And you go in and you open your Google form during your slot. If you don't get to it during your slot, that's not a problem. Remember, nothing's late until after 11:59. You just go in at another time period and start another block. Remember, the blocks are 8 to 11, 11 to 2, 2 to 5, 5 to 8, or 9 to 12. And so you go into that block and you have 3 solid hours. Extra credit. If you were one of the top 3, you know what you got on the extra credit for the test. If you were number 4 or 5, you got 30 extra points, 35 extra points. If you were any of the others, you got 25 extra points, and they're already on PowerSchool. You'll see that. The other thing is with PowerSchool, if I'm going to from now on make sure that if you're missing something that is great on PowerSchool, that in PowerSchool it's going to say day 20. So if you're missing, for example, day 20 on PowerSchool, then all you need to do is log and say, well, what could I have done on day 20 that would have been a grade? Let's see, day 20. Day 20. Well, it's not the lesson. Well, this was the video. Again, I just threw that as an example, but you get my point. So whatever it is, whatever date is in, oh, here it is, day 20 activity. So it's the student responsibility. So that's why if you didn't get that updated, you have a 0. Once you turn it in, I will give you partial credit. You must fill out the late form submission thing. There's too many platforms. I'm not going around looking for things. All you have to do is go into classwork, go down to rules, procedures, and policies, and you'll see VHI missing assignment. Fill it out. I will get back to you very quickly, but I need to be notified through this form. Last thing, Kahoot. When you go online tomorrow, you will see a Kahoot. This, of course, is not going to be a real-time Kahoot because we're not all going to be on at the same time. It will give you a link and it will go from question to question. Once you start it, you can't stop it. So it's going to go from question to question, question to question. There's like 22 questions. So you're going to need about 10, 15 minutes. This is your activity for Tuesday. Once you go through it, it's going to give you a score. The top 10 will get extra credit on the test. So there's 116 of you. The first 10 of you, it doesn't matter what class you are, it's just going to be the top 10 altogether. Once you start it, you can't stop it. You can only take it once. If you try to take it twice, then you're not going to be eligible for extra credit, and you must use your real first and last name. Any questions? Please reach out to me. Try to go into your classroom at the time of our regularly scheduled classroom. If not, I will talk to you later.